So yeah, before we get into the level, I'd like to ask about the sort of general kind of world design of Will of the Wisps. At this point of the game, or a little bit earlier, you've just got to a point where you need to get the wisps, and they're in four different areas throughout the whole world. How did you kind of come to this, decision to have it so the game massively opens up and allow the player to choose where they're going to go, and sort of what considerations did you have for that type of thing?
Yeah, there were a lot of considerations and it wasn't easy. But yeah, basically the first game was just this kind of linear, chain of area to area to area, even though it is relatively open to some Metroidvania, but you still had choices and places you could go before others, especially in the definitive edition. The team, that was before I joined Moon, the team decided to add these extra sort of optional areas because that was something that really Thomas, the creative director for Ori, he really missed from the initial release. And I'm pretty sure he was pushing pretty hard to have optional areas and choice and things like that to give the players more freedom. But it just didn't make the cut because of production concerns, my guess is, because I wasn't there for that. But definitely from the start, when I was brought on to Ori 2, one of the very first things that I learned that, the goal was to have more openness and more freedom and choices for the player to make in how they would sort of explore and tackle the world. So it was already from the get-go of the sequel, this one is going to have a more open structure than the first one, right? Mm. But then the question arose well, how do you tell a nice linear narrative, that worked quite well for the first Ori game? How do you control that and make sure that you're getting these steady story beats and all that kind of stuff in this more open structure, which was definitely a big problem to solve throughout the production. But then on a more mechanical level, there was obviously, well, how do you maintain the balance of the game? Because if the player goes to this area before that area, they might have a bad time because the enemies are just stronger. And in some games, it's nice that you go to an area, you see strong enemies or difficult challenges, and you go, I'm probably not ready for this yet. I should come back later. Mm. But some players are very determined, let's say, where they find an area and they just want to go through it. They're like, if I can get here now, I should probably be able to get through this at this point, right? Without realizing that the designers are probably trying to gently tell you, maybe you should go to the other area first. And so we wanted to be careful about those kind of blockers. And especially in the second act of the game, where the game really opens up, we didn't want to force people to take one path over another. Even in a soft way. We really wanted it to be, if you choose to go to the Luma pools first, if that's where you end up naturally while exploring, you should be able to complete Luma pools at that point of the game. And if you go to Moldwood Depths or whatever, right, you should be able to do the same thing. And it will be more challenging, actually, in the final game. It is more challenging if you go to the areas with bosses before going to the area that don't have bosses, because you're underpowered, you have less experience and stuff, so they're going to be more challenging. But if you end up going to those areas later on, then you tend to have an easier time with them. But it's just a byproduct of, it's the trade-off that you make for having that freedom of choice. And interestingly enough, the Windswept Wastes it was kind of an outlier from the rest of those areas, because it is the last area you have to do to be able to progress the story forward once you've done all the other open areas. But we decided to not block it off at the start of that area and say, no, you can't even enter the Windswept Wastes until you've done all these things. We wanted to still give you a chance to discover this cool desert environment and get this new cool ability quite early. But there had to be something at a certain point in the progression that told you, you can't go forward anymore. You need to go off and explore the other areas. And that's where we put the blockage of the Windtorn Ruins, which is at the end of this area, that basically tells you, okay, you made it this far, but you're going to need to basically get the key to this door. And the key was all the wisps that you have to collect in all the other areas. But it was nice that people had the opportunity to even explore this cool, unique, diverse area, even if it wasn't necessarily part of, the golden path at that moment,
Did you have any worries about it? There's a sort of possibility of this area feeling a little bit anticlimactic, and that you get to the end of it and it goes, well, hold on, you can't actually finish this area yet because you haven't got all the wisps. Is that ever a sort of concern?
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, it did come up when we were playtesting with the team and everything else. And we tried our best to really make sure that it didn't feel as anticlimactic as possible. And we also wanted to make sure that we put fast travel spirit wells as close to the end, or let's say the entrance of that that temple that you can't enter as possible. It's in the exact same, like right beneath the tower, basically, so that even though you feel like, oh crap, I can't go further, you at least can go backtrack a tiny bit, and you can always fast travel right back without having to redo the entire area all over again. Because I think that would be the biggest issue, is if it's like, oh, I did this area, now I have to go do it a second time just to get back to where I got left off. But we also wanted to make sure that when you got to the entrance of the ruins, despite the fact that they're blocked, that you would get a new quest pop up that basically says, like, I think it was something like the ancient ruins or something like this, right? That basically, oh, okay, I didn't just get stopped, but I discovered something new along the way, and now I have more information about, like, reinforcing the fact that I need to go get these wisps. But you at least made a discovery, and okay, I will be coming back here later. And I think in a Metroidvania, that's actually a very, very nice thing that people tend to appreciate. I think it's just because we have this sort of strong narrative thread throughout the entire game, just like the first Ori. Sometimes those dead ends can start to feel a little bit, a bit like you said, a bit anticlimactic, right? Because you're looking for that next story beat. You're looking to push things forward wherever you go. And when you get to a place where there isn't a cutscene, there isn't a boss, there isn't an escape right now, you might feel a little bit like, what did I come here for? But at least you leave with a cool new ability, having gained some experience, leveled things up, found some shards and new, health buffs and things like that. And also you have a fast travel zone where you can easily come back later. So in the end, it was, again, one of those trade-offs that we decided to make, but it definitely didn't break the experience from what we observed and how we felt.
Okay, cool. So let's start moving into the world. So was this a case of, of like knowing that you wanted, did you like lay out the world and go, right, what are we going to put here, here, and here? Or did you come up with the ideas for this world and then figure out where it was going to go? Like, what was the kind of the structure there in terms of design?
Yeah, this one was an interesting one. It was actually, it was very much mechanics focused at first. It was basically exploring what are the different kinds of gameplay elements that we could have for the environment, what are the abilities that we could have. But actually, if I'm honest, it goes back even before we knew we wanted to make an area like this. Like when I first joined the team, one of my first tasks as a level designer was to come up with some interesting level design situations using these platforms that collapse when you stand on them, which actually are featured in the Windswept Wastes. But back then, it was just a very simple gameplay element, very basic prototype. And it's like, how can we use this in interesting ways? And so I did a bunch of sketches for how we could use these platforms. And then I kind of blocked out or did block out tests for different situations and level, sequences that could be interesting to use those in. But it wasn't like there was a grand master plan of this environment and exactly what we wanted to introduce and when and everything at that stage, at least. It was very much a long process throughout the production of doing research and R&D into gameplay elements, but then also looking into different abilities. Like, for example, a lot of what's in the Windswept Wastes came as a result of wanting this burrow ability. And that actually, it wasn't because we had a desert environment that we said we want to be able to burrow in sand. It was because we said way early on in the project, what are some cool, unique moves that would complement Ori's already really robust moveset? And burrow was something that we looked into, we thought about. We saw a video from Sonic Colors where there was a cool ability, some kind of weird little guy you collect that makes you dig in these big volumes. And it was like, hey, that could be a really interesting, traversal method for a Metroidvania. And especially it lent itself very well to the idea of blocking off areas, but being gated by not having a certain ability, and then having to come back later. And now you can use that ability to get somewhere you couldn't before. Like, for example, you've got the wall of sand on the right here on the screen, and it's a very simple blocker where it's like, this is a solid wall, but I have the impression that this is for something later. And once you get that ability, suddenly now that wall is actually a fully traversable environment, like a fully traversable space. And so a lot of the process of basically, and I have these videos and concepts I can show you at some point, but it was very much a process of creating isolated, interesting, basically level sequences, just in isolation, just seeing what are fun ways, different permutations of using the various different abilities plus gameplay mechanics. And then once we had a nice, let's say, collection of things that we thought were very cool and worked, we strung them together into a demo that was made for Microsoft. to basically show them this is a new ability we've been R&Ding, and we wanted to show it in its best light. So we took all of our favorite sequences and put them in a logical order. And that was actually the very first step of creating this environment, pretty much. But then it went through a lot of overhauls and reworks and shuffling and all these kinds of things. And it did then get like that big picture pass where we were like, okay, we know these isolated rooms and scenes that we want to use that are really fun on their own, but which one should come first, in what order, what's the most logical, rational way of introducing the player to all the different mechanics in the level and all that kind of stuff. And then we just started to sort of put a flow together pretty much. But yeah, so like I said, it really just came down to a lot of freeform R&D and exploration for things, and then kind of like starting to build up an environment around those mechanics, as opposed to just creating an environment and then figuring out what would be interesting to do in it later.
So you said that these platforms started as just like blocks that you'd stand on, they disappear. At what point did you sort of make the connection between, these could be sand, and then that would fit nicely with the burrow mechanic?
That came later, yeah. And that I actually have a couple of videos about that too. And the videos actually have my commentary on them, because it was for sharing with the team. And I'm like, I was just playing with this the other day, and I was like, I thought, what might be interesting is if these things are made of sand and you can burrow through them, because I created a scenario, I created a little level. I don't know if you want me to share my screen quickly and show you the block out. So in this environment, basically what I was playing with was, you have these collapsing platforms above lasers, right? And the idea would be that you have to gauge yourself as you land on them, and you have to glide, and you have to wait for the right opportunity to then drop through the laser and gauge yourself that way. So it's a little bit of it's really straightforward collapsing platform challenge, let's say. But then by the time I got to the bottom of this thing, when I was building this out, I was like, that was cool. But that's a one-way thing, And for a Metroidvania of all things, that's not acceptable. You can't have one-way corridors. You need to always be able to backtrack, re-explore, retraverse. And so then it was like, well, how am I supposed to get back up? And I thought, well, I could have an alternate route that loops around and this and that. But then you have all this thought process of like, but that's really tedious, and I don't want to take like this long way around. I just want to be able to go back where I came from. And so then what I did was I asked one of the programmers to quickly, to basically take the sand colliders, basically, whatever it is, the sand zones, and give them the sort of collapsing property. So they could disappear and reappear, but then you could also dig through them. And so then that resulted in me basically being able to create this situation where now you can backtrack just by digging through these platforms. And all of a sudden, it started to make sense. It was like, wait a second, these things, you can do much more with them in the environment and level design. And it really starts to open up, the possibilities and the flow opportunities and things like that in a way that we didn't have before. And there was another example here where I was playing around with it. These things didn't make it into the final game, because it was just, prototyping and figuring out ideas. But another simple situation where it was just a basic collapsing platform puzzle or situation, right? And when you go through it the first time, it's like, okay, it's pretty straightforward and standard. It's just keep moving, do a nice flow, get through the sequence. But then obviously the idea being that when you come back and retraverse with the burrow later on in the environment, you can basically just shoot back straight through the environment in just like 2 burrows. And who wouldn't think that that's super cool in a Metroidvania to be able to just bypass like this long platforming sequence with just a couple new unique moves that you've earned, right? And so actually, it's funny because I want to say it a little bit like, I'm a bit ashamed of how long it took to put 2 and 2 together, that those things worked, but I'm not really, because it was never the intention from the beginning. We didn't make these collapsing platforms with this burrow in mind, because that didn't exist at the time, but then as I was prototyping and playing, it was just one of those things that naturally came out of the exploration. And it just felt like a light bulb moment. Like, hey, that just makes all kinds of, sense. It feels cool. It's unique and everything else. And it's one of those things where for a Metroidvania, it's super important that a gameplay element sort of like has multiple purposes depending on the abilities you've unlocked. So that you really feel like, okay, I know how this thing works, right? When I'm going through it the first time. But then I get a new ability and all of a sudden it's recontextualized and now I have to relearn it again in a different way. And suddenly now an opportunity that I didn't know how to reach before, I just shoot through the bottom of a platform, which I couldn't. And now I got something special for it. So that's how that kind of came to be pretty much.
Yeah, I feel like I noticed a bit of a pattern in these sort of four areas of you'd get there, and the first time you're going through it, or sort of the first sort of half of it, you're using, for example, like in Bowers Reach, you're using the furnaces to light the brazier things, and then you get the light ball thing. I can't remember the names of anything. Then you get the light ball, and then you can sort of light them yourself. So you get like the start of the level, you're kind of using the environment in one way, and then later you get the power up that lets you use it in a more efficient and easier way. So it's kind of like a nice way to let the player kind of speed through it the second time.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's like, and the interesting thing for me personally is I hadn't worked on a Metroidvania before working on Ori, basically. I came from a history of working on just purely level-based platforming, like old school Mario games and stuff. And so working on this was definitely a huge learning experience for me. And definitely like it became very, very apparent that the philosophy of level design had to change for me. Like the team was already quite, well-versed in that kind of thing, but I had to think differently about how to construct spaces and not think, you can't do any of these, or many, let's say, of these one-off situations where in a game like Rayman, for example, you could have a level design sequence that basically you touch a trigger, this whole thing collapses and explodes. And if you manage to survive, cool, you can keep going with the level, but you can't go backwards. And that's okay, because you just restart the level if you want to do it again. But in a Metroidvania, if all of a sudden your path backwards is broken, now you're screwed, you can't go back. And, the whole idea of the game is just kind of destroyed. And so it really was about, well, how can we create cool and exciting and dynamic situations that make the world feel alive and reactive and all that kind of stuff, but that also facilitate the ability to traverse and retraverse and all that kind of stuff. And how do you make that retraversal feel more and more satisfying and fun, make the player feel more powerful the longer they spend in the game world, pretty much. And with things like, for example, the grapple that you use on the blue moss here, for example, that was a great example, I think, of once you get that ability at the wellspring, it just completely opens things up for you. And you see that immediately when you exit the wellspring, because you've got all this blue moss that you can start to grapple to. And it feels like a whole new world, pretty much. It almost feels like a game breaking ability to me, because you can grab these things from so far away. And then it's up to us to continue to create unique and interesting situations that challenge that and combine it with different abilities that we give throughout the experience.
How do you like decide just like how far away can the player be before they can grapple? Like, what is the process there?
At the end of the day, it pretty much was, if you can see it on screen, you should be able to grapple to it. Because I think it's this expectation that the player has of like, I see blue moss, I have this ability that basically pulls me to blue moss. I feel like I should be able to grab myself to it. And any kind of arbitrary distance check that we did, because of course, originally we tried not to allow it from so far away, because it feels kind of exploity, It makes it difficult to design really tight situations sometimes. But the more we play tested with the team and ourselves, the more it was obvious that it just doesn't work that way. It has to be like, you see it on screen, you can target it pretty much. And we just had, in level design, we had to live with those constraints. But obviously a tool that we have at our disposal to circumvent that is the camera, because we can make the camera tighter on a certain area than another to prevent the player from having this in view until they're in a certain spot or whatever. And that way we can say, cool, we can prevent you from just zooming through an entire screen until it's the opportune moment or the intended moment to do so.
As I forgot to ask a second ago, was there any specific Metroidvanias that you sort of played for research when you came onto the project?
I did play Guacamelee shortly before actually joining. It wasn't because I applied at Moon that I played it. I just played it because it looked super fun and then I wanted to check it out when I was working at Ubisoft, and I loved it. And I mean, when I applied at Moon, they gave me a code to play Ori or let's say Moon contacted me and I hadn't played Ori yet. And so the very first interview was extremely short, which was just, have you played Ori? No, here's a code, go play it and talk to me a little bit later when you're done, right? And so then I reached out a few days later, like, hey, I 100%ed the thing, let's have a chat. I really liked it. But I wasn't like the Metroidvanias were not necessarily like my genre that I would play all the time. You know what I mean? Like as a kid, I usually played more level-based platformers, or especially like collectathon 3D platformers. That was really my jam. But I did play games like Metroid Prime 1 and 2, which arguably are similar to Metroidvanias, just in a three-dimensional way. But yeah, I mean, I did look into things like Castlevania, and obviously when Hollow Knight came out, like we all checked it out because it was really cool and everything. But yeah, so I like, it wasn't one of those things where I kind of like dove in and played every single Metroidvania known to man to kind of get a feel for it. It's something that I kind of organically learned while working with a team of people who knew how Metroidvanias worked. And I liked the fact that I could kind of bring some of my level-based platformer sensibilities to sort of shake things up a bit and not have it just too much like, this is how Metroidvanias work.
So was it like a specific sort of task for you or plan to bring the sort of Rayman or Mario style level design into Ori? Because I feel like Will of the Wisps definitely does feel more like each world has like a mechanic that is explored and then kind of thrown away to a degree for the next level. Like, was that kind of your thing?
I wouldn't say that it was anything I was particularly tasked with, and I wouldn't say that it's something that was like a conscious desire on the part of, for example, Thomas or the team. Like, we need more of that stuff in the game. But it admittedly is probably a sensibility that I brought with me when I joined the team, and I felt like, hey, like it is cool. Like, we have these very distinct, unique, interesting like art designs for these environments. And it would be a real shame to not lean into that in some way and really try to, you know, squeeze the most out of the potential for, well, what would you expect in a desert environment? And what could we do with those elements pretty much, as opposed to just kind of like saying, well, we have these springs and we have these, you know, very common elements, and let's just use those everywhere and have pretty looking environments. It's kind of a thing where I start to go a little bit like, these places are all starting to feel a little bit samey. You know, like, how can we differentiate them? How can we make them feel more memorable, more unique, and give the player a cool experience of discovery as they explore from place to place? So I think that's, I'm not saying I don't want to take the credit for it per se, right? Because it's not any one person, but it's definitely something like a personal sensibility of mine that I think like came through in the work that I did and the stuff that I personally pushed for during production.
Yeah. This is a really cool sort of section because it's like using almost like the inverse of what you've been doing of before. You don't want the platforms really to destroy, but this time you sort of specifically want them to destroy. How do you sort of come up with little things like this?
That's also, again, one of those I have a video of it too, but it's one of the earliest blockouts that I did for this, because that's the kind of designer I am. There are multiple ways of like designing levels I've noticed over the years, where some people are like, I start with the very first room of the environment, and then I just work out from there. And I just let the game sort of organically unfold as it feels natural to me to do so, right? And I'm very much in the category of, I like to basically workshop. I take the elements that I have at my disposal, either based on the brief that I have for a level or something, or that I think could be interesting, and I prototype them myself. And then I just create as many unique scenarios that I can without worrying too much about learning, without learning about how can I mix in other things, just I don't give myself those constraints. And so I was like, what would be an interesting way to flip the collapsing platform on its head? And well, what about if you have to intentionally make all of them disappear without touching the ground, so that way you can like escort a projectile across? And it led to that simple situation. And it's one of those things where I think you actually made a video about it that I remember about, workshopping and Mario Maker, right? Where it's like the way that you sort of create interesting situations, you take the elements and you try to make interesting combinations of different things and create unique situations that exploit all of their unique traits and properties and all that kind of stuff. And that's very much my way of working pretty much. So that's how I always try to think like, what are different unique ways of using these elements that don't feel samey? Because you can do the very simple, it's a longer sequence where I have to jump from platform to platform. This time it's like 3 times as long, or there's a vertical in the middle or something. But at a certain point, it starts to feel like it's just all versions of the same thing. And that's where, for example, when the being able to dig through them showed up, that's where it was like super cool for me, because all of a sudden you can do things like this, where you have this platform that you fall down and it feels like a one way. And you're like, how am I supposed to get back up? And then when you get the ability and you realize you can dig through, you have that aha moment of like, oh, that's cool. And now it recontextualizes things once again. So, yeah.
So once you've kind of made a whole bunch of like ideas or little sequences, how do you decide what order to put them in? Also, like the thing we just did with the escorting the laser beam was, optional. It was like a little secret. How do you decide which things should be secrets, which things to be critical path?
Yeah, it's a very organic process. We have these different different levels that we think are more integral, let's say, to the environment, right? And we just want to make sure that those sort of appear in the golden path. And then there are other ones like the puzzle you just did, where, to be honest, the feedback from people in the team wasn't always 100% that they all got it, right? It wasn't super straightforward for everyone. And it felt like, well, this is definitely something that we can flag as optional, that not everybody needs to play or see. But that for people who get it, it's a nice little reward, like something extra that explores the mechanics in a unique way. So it's cool that you say you appreciate it, because that's exactly what it was there for. It wasn't something that we needed to challenge everybody in. We didn't want to make it on the main path where you have to do this to open the gate forward. It was one of those ones that I liked because it was one of my earlier simple little puzzle setups, right? I'm not arguing that it's the best thing in the world, but I thought it was kind of cool. And I kind of like pushed to keep it somewhere in the environment because I thought it was worth keeping around.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. Well, let's talk about Burrow. So how did this sort of come about? And also just talk me through the way you designed this power-up.
Yeah, it's like I said, we were basically at a point very early on in the project going, and it's kind of a very exciting point in a project like this, right? Where it's kind of like just free form, what kind of abilities could we give to this really cool platforming character? And that in itself is super exciting to me because it's really like the fact that you can do this in this game, it's just so different from anything you had in the very first one. And it feels like it's ties in quite well to the rest of his moves, the feel that he has and everything else. And so we were just kind of like, well, what can we add to his already pretty robust moveset that would lend itself to creating new unique scenarios that we didn't see in the previous game or in any of our current level prototypes pretty much. And this was one of many that, or this was one of like a lot of ones that we threw around. This was one that kind of stuck because it seemed like a very interesting concept. But actually, I can share my screen again because this is one where I have quite a bit of material on it as well. Where, of course, you can check the blackout videos after the interview, but especially in like the concept sketches, I honestly just started with doing a couple sketches like this, nice. Where basically it's okay. So there's sand, and you have to get up here. You can't wall jump because there's spikes there. How do you get up? Well, you have to dig through this wall, and then you have to launch yourself out. And then I started, as I was looking at the situation, I added this kind of sand thing above here. And I was like, well, wouldn't it be cool if I could dash out upwards based on my aiming, my trajectory, and then dash backwards into another sand zone? And I have this feeling of control, and it like opens up for like a more expert move. And you can put a reward up here because it's not an easy thing to do, right? And then I just start like playing with different ideas, like, okay. And funny with this one, you can actually see this exact situation in the final game, pretty much in one of the scenes. But basically there's spikes at the bottom. You can't glide across because it's too flat. It's too difficult. And so you have to basically dig along the roof. And that also is just this kind of thing that feels cool that you don't normally do, that it's like normally you go on the ground, but now you have to go above. Or I even sketched out things like this. You see in the windswept wastes, there are these little hanging balls of sand that are like physical and everything. And you can basically dash through them from any side, any direction. And then it launches you straight through in a straight line. And so I sketched something like this as the initial concept for that. And it worked out quite well in the game. Like, it's one of my favorite uses of the burrow because it's so versatile and it gives such a feeling of control that you can really like dash in from any direction you want. And then so I just sketched out an idea like this, where it's like, this would not be possible without this ability. And it would create a very interesting like level space for you to sort of explore this way. And
are these sketches for like programmers or for other designers?
Ideally, it was at the very beginning, it was just for pitching these ideas to the design team to say like, this is how I imagine the ability working. And so, for example, in this one, it was sort of illustrating, well, Ori's normal jump height here, he would jump straight into these spikes. And there's no way to get over them because he doesn't have a higher jump, But then, well, what if I jump and dive into the sand and then dash out? And now I can suddenly clear it because the dash jump is higher than normal, right? And so that again was sort of informing the intention with the metrics and all that kind of stuff. Like, what is it that we're actually, what makes this ability unique and gives us potential to make cool level scenarios. And so what happened was, after I did a series of these sketches, some of them made it into the game in one form or another, other ones didn't, then what I would do is I would actually just recreate these situations in the blockouts. So for example, this one, just the ability to flip an enemy upside down, that required programmer support to get working, but it was a pretty standard, straightforward thing, that we knew we would want and we'd want to be able to support. Or this one, for example, the get burrow room, where it's like, clearly you want there to be flat ground that's sand that you can't enter. You want a tree in the middle. You want a platform that's higher than you can normally reach, so you're locked in. And then it forces you to dive down and explore this new ability and collect things by jumping high and all that kind of stuff. And it did, again, it made it into the environment in one form. Just obviously it went through the iteration process and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, then basically we would take these and then block them out into actual playable level designs. But obviously we didn't have the ability yet, right? So you couldn't actually play the thing. And then that's when we would take it to the programmers and say, okay, look, we have these environments. We want to be able to play them the way that they're illustrated in these schematics and everything else. We got some animations from the animation team. So for example, like just very, simple animation tests and things like this that could then be broken out into actual usable animations for implementation and all that kind of stuff. And then we would basically get the first playable prototype of it, where we would be able to actually play those environments the way that they were sketched out. And that became very exciting because it was like, up until that point, it had just been something on a concept. It was just something that existed in our minds of like, this is how I imagine this playing. And then you actually get your hands on it and it feels, pretty cool. But then obviously there's months and years of fine tuning and tweaking the controls and everything else to make it feel just as cool as it does in the final game, because it never feels that way from the start. Actually, like if you look, this was the proof of concept level that we had to show Microsoft. We want to show off the original burrow. You can see that it feels actually slower than the final game. And what you're probably going to see as well is that the turning isn't as tight as it is in the final game. You kind of make these bigger circles. And the original intention that we wanted, or at least that I was pushing for at the beginning, was I wanted it to feel a bit tricky to control, that it felt like there was some, friction in the sand and you're not as nimble as you always are and everything else. But the more we play tested it with the team, the more we tightened it up, because ultimately Ori controls are tight, like all around. And it had to sort of feel just as tight to kind of explore and play with these mechanics as well. And in the end, I'm happy that we got there, right? It's just one of those things that when you're in the process, you don't immediately see these things, and it takes some feedback and cycles to really get on the same page. But you can see the animation is very rudimentary. Ori just stays straight. He's not bending and curving as he digs through the sand and everything. But you're already seeing the DNA of the various types of situations and challenges that we want sort of starting to take shape. And at this point, you can even see that I was using the collapsing platforms, but I wasn't actually, they're not made of sand. They're just the collapsing platform. So even at this stage, that layer hadn't been necessarily added to it yet. And already it was like, and we were trying to use these platforms in interesting ways as well. This situation, for example, didn't make it into the final game because many people in the team couldn't figure it out, the puzzle, basically. They didn't really like it all that much. But that, again, it's all part of the process, right? Like we are our worst critics and our first critics. We throw it to the team, and if really, not enough people are appreciating something, then we take it to heart and we go, okay, let's try something else that everyone does agree on, that everyone does like. But yeah, so we went through this process of creating the very first implementation. And something else that I wanted to mention, which I found quite interesting looking back at these, is it's hard to notice, but in the bottom corner on the Y button in the very early UI, prototype of being able to equip freely, there's an ability there, which is actually the burrow. So the very first version of the burrow was something you had to equip to one of your buttons. And so it would actually occupy one of those spaces, and you'd have to make a choice. Do I want to have the burrow equipped right now or not? And very, very late into the process of creating the E3 demo for the environment, which was the windswept wastes and showing off the burrow ability, we still had this equipable burrow in the game. And it was only until very late in that process that, and I'm not saying that we probably didn't mention that it was an issue until that point. Like, I think we're all very aware that it wasn't the sexiest way to control something like this, because it's a traversal move. You kind of want it available at all times. That we started discussing, well, what about a contextual input, pretty much? And so that basically led us to saying, well, it feels like a natural extension of the dash. Basically you're just launching yourself into the ground. And so it's like, well, why couldn't it just be, if you try to dash into the ground, when you're close enough to it, then you do a burrow instead of doing a dash. And so we tried rolling those into the same input, and it changed everything. It felt like an extension of Ori's basic moveset pretty much that way. And you didn't have to sacrifice a slot for it and all that kind of stuff. And obviously it takes a bit of getting used to for certain people, because that is where that distance check thing I mentioned with the grapple comes into play, because you can't have the player dashing into sand from all the way on the other side of the screen. It would be ridiculous. Sure. And sometimes there are still moments where players try to dash and they end up digging, or the other way around, but it just comes with the territory of trying to create something that is wrapped, like multiple functions wrapped into one button press. But for the most part, I personally feel like it was a success, the way that it was integrated into the controller and everything. And that's when it really started to feel like this natural, cool ability. And luckily we did that before the E3 demo, because it wouldn't have been as nice otherwise if we hadn't made that choice. So yeah.
Okay, cool. Let's get back to where we were. So you have these like things that are layered throughout each of the worlds, like these spirit trials and the map maker and little quests and stuff. What sort of point are you putting those things in, and what sort of considerations are there for adding these like additional parts that aren't like part of the main gameplay mechanic?
Yeah, that's a good one. Though those come quite late, because obviously like it's more about, usually they come in at certain pacing moments in an environment, I'd say, like especially the map maker Lupo. He's not something that you want to put at the very entrance of an environment. So you don't want to say, just because it's a cool situation for him to be hidden in, that we want him to be there like right at the very beginning. So what happens is, we want him to come in around halfway through the environment, so that way you can explore a bit, get your feet wet. And then when you find him, you go, oh, cool. Do I want to spend some money on seeing what's coming, or do I just want to keep exploring, in the dark, pretty much? And so, for example, in the E3 demo, Lupo was actually below here in the corridor where there's actually this guy asking for water. And we added him up here later on, because it felt a little bit too straightforward, a bit too simple, that he's just in your main path. And we wanted to actually reward the player for having done this, found this little secret alcove up there. And especially because it challenges the player to use the burrow ability on this new sandball for the first time without it being forced in the main path, So it becomes this kind of like, you feel like you did something extra special, and you get an extra special reward for having done so. But it definitely, that comes late in the process. Things like, for example, the spirit trials, they have to come near the end, because they're completely dependent on the level design that you have to work with. So actually what we did was we played the environments we had. So we were talking about the spirit trials. Yeah. So basically we have to play the levels that we already have to find, well, what is the coolest, sexiest like flow possibility for going through a chunk of that environment in a way that has a lot of room for improvement and shaving off seconds and all that. So it's something that just comes, it comes near the end, and we experiment and try, well, what if we put the start here and the end here? Would this feel long enough? Would it feel fun, and everything else? And so it's not like we designed spaces specifically for those spirit trials. We chose spaces that felt like they lent themselves the best to it. But then we would also go back and refine and revise those areas that we determined were good for that, to make them flow as well as possible as well. Like we would add extra little elements, extra little paths, tweak some of the placements and the layout, so we could facilitate like the coolest flows possible for it.
Once you've got the burrow, you're kind of like left onto your own devices to figure out where to go next. It's not, going forward. You've kind of got to go back for a bit. How do you, you're giving the player a lot of opportunities to get lost here, I guess. But how do you make sure they still have a fun experience after they've kind of been given this this more open-ended bit?
That was actually a tricky one. If you pay attention to the environment, there's actually two ways to get back to the main path. And a lot of players tend to go down this path that you just went through, because it's like, it's tempting. It's like a big sand zone. And then you realize you get deposited back into an earlier section of the level. And then it feels exciting because now you can re-explore all of these sand zones that you missed when you came through, or not that you missed per se, but that you couldn't actually do anything with your first time through. But then there's actually another path like that was above when you came out of the Get Dig room that leads you sort of to the golden path as well. And it was just about like, we want the players to feel like they have options and that they are free to sort of explore and discover and see what's exciting and fun to do with the burrow now that they have it, you know. And that, like, we kind of wanted that feeling of openness and discovery, as opposed to it just being now get to the main path and get on with it pretty much. But basically the bottom line is that all roads kind of lead to the same destination, so that no matter what, you're going to eventually land on where you have to be. That's just the way it goes pretty much.
It's nice that you can come back to the sort of earlier parts of the level and there are things for you to explore. And I guess was part of it like putting these little tempting things throughout the beginning of the level to goad players to come back and check it out?
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, we're always trying to fill up every inch of our environments, of our every inch of the screen. We're trying to fill it up with cool, fun things to find and discover, and especially on repeat visits. We want things to feel like, you know, there's stuff to unpack and definitely things for you to get now that you have new abilities or better understanding of how things work and all that kind of stuff, combining abilities like you're doing here, for example. But to be honest, a number of these little sequences, like this one you're doing right here with the baby worm and bash and everything, they're little sequences that we kind of like, that I think I almost had in a test scene, you know, and it didn't necessarily deserve to be its own full scene and sequence in the main path or whatever, but it was a fun enough challenge to kind of provide the player and say, hey, you know, figure this one out. And it feels kind of satisfying for it to happen organically in the environment in a place where they had to do other things the first time they came through. So again, it's like we have when we're building these things, we have kind of like a surplus of ideas, right? And then it starts to be, well, which ones make the cut and how do we fit them into the environment that we have and make the most out of it pretty much. So yeah, sometimes they're there like from the minute you build the scene the first time. It's not that we build the environment and only do the golden path, right? That's not, and then later on we come in and add all of the extras. Like it's more of an organic process where we're building the environment when we feel it, you know. And it's like, if it feels like, oh, there's a cool opportunity for a secret here or an optional, you know, sequence or whatever, we'll just throw it in there, you know. And then later on we might take it out because it doesn't fit the grand scheme of the environment once we've play tested it or built more of it, or we'll add more things or whatever. But yeah, it's really, at the end of the day, our level design process isn't something that's super formulaic or like by the books, where it's like, this is how you build an environment and we always start the same way and finish the same way. Most of it was like each level designer that was on the team kind of had our own way of working, and the team just facilitated us building things the way that we like to in the method that we chose. But then obviously we had to evaluate them, make sure they were consistent in the final product and that they all kind of, you know, fit well together and all that kind of stuff. But how you get there, like that's just, you know, for each person to kind of determine themselves.
How do you, what's your sort of process for ramping up the difficulty of a mechanic over time? Because like we started with the burrows, but then we start getting into bits where there's spikes lining the sand and there's enemies in the sand. Like, well, how do you make sure that it's ramping up in a nice, fair way?
Usually it's once you start to have an order and well, so as a designer, you kind of have to gauge the difficulty of adding extra layers on top of certain mechanics, right? So for example, like the simplest version of a collapsing platform is the horizontal one, and you just have to jump onto it and then jump off, right? But then you put it vertically and all of a sudden now it's more complicated because you have to wall jump on something that's falling apart, and wall jump is already slightly more difficult than a normal jump would be. And it's the same for any kind of mechanic, like the burrow, for example. So having to then aim and burrow through a ball like this is something that's far more complicated to understand and do and perform than it is to just simply stand on a sand floor, hold down, and then press the burrow button like you do in the very, very first get burrow scene, right? And so it's about understanding the layers of complexity that are added on top each time you change up the recipe, or you change up the elements in a given situation, and then sort of gauging that, where should that best be placed, what comes first. And there's also one thing you really don't want to do is take the learning for one specific element in isolation and kind of get it all over with in one row. Like, you don't want to just say, okay, here's all 3 or 4 difficulty escalations of one specific gameplay element or move, and then completely move on to another one and do the same thing. You kind of want to, intersperse them and mix them around and everything else. So that way it feels like there's variety throughout the experience, and you're kind of progressively unfolding, learning the mechanics, but you're not necessarily just kind of throwing them all out there in one go for the player to have to kind of just do in a formulaic way, pretty much, if that makes sense.
Yeah. You say you have to gauge the sort of difficulty of these things. Is that just you doing it, or are you getting play testers in to help with that sort of thing?
Oh, yeah, of course. There's always play testing is always key in these things. Some things you can just kind of get that they're easier than others, because you just instinctively understand that, yeah, this is a layer of complexity, too far compared to the very basic version of it. But other things, you think that things are very easy and straightforward, and then you get them in the hands of other people, and all of a sudden you're like, wow, that was way harder than we thought it was supposed to be, right? That's not what we wanted. So we'll have to keep that in mind in how we introduce this in the environment. This is a very notorious scene in the development team. It was one of the hardest platforming puzzle scenes that we had in the game by far for people, because of this specific part you're in right now.
Yeah, I actually got to this bit when I was playing it before and left because I thought, I don't know if I can do this.
Well, it's funny because it's one of those things where, again, it plays on your expectations of what you're supposed to be doing here, because I'll spoil it for you so you can actually experience it. But you actually have to bash a projectile to the right into that little alcove, and then you have to dash over and bash it again to be able to get up to the second part. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's one of those things where this was one where definitely it didn't belong in the main path, but it was cool enough for hardcore players and stuff that it felt worth having in the game. But it's not gating any really important or crucial progress or collectibles. It's just there to really challenge people. So
I did it, but then now I'm here. Oh my God.
It's fine. Abort.
I got it. Right, we're going up here and then over here. But it's still using the sort of sand stuff. So it very much feels like part of the game. There we go.
No, exactly. And that was, again, one of those versions that I was playing with in very, very early prototypes of like, oh, what if these things were blocking lasers? And so the challenge is you actually have to jump off them but then it reveals a dangerous obstacle below you. And now you have a new challenge that you didn't have. Or for example, here, you're freeing the lasers when you're going up, but the minute you touch the ground at the top, they get blocked all over again. And now suddenly it feels different in terms of challenge because you're actually gliding instead of platforming upwards, So, but definitely it was one of those things that in playtest, it was clear that it was not the easiest thing in the world. And so it got relegated to a side room. But, games like this, they need challenging side rooms to give players something to chew on when they're really like completionists or looking for a good, challenge pretty much.
This level, like most of the levels in this game, are completely stuffed with secrets to find. How do you find a good balance between it being like actually fun to find versus no one ever even found this because it's too well hidden? Like, how do you strike that balance?
It's not super easy, I guess. Like we don't go for the crazy obscure secrets. I think for example, this secret is a perfect example of how we tend to do it, where what you'll see is that there's a little lip when you're out of the secret wall. There's a little bit of a lip here where you're like, this looks like this concave shape pretty much that guides your eye and tells you there might be something behind here pretty much, and rewards you for thinking so because you walk in and it fades away pretty much. And it's the same for sort of breakable walls. We kind of have these visuals that kind of indicate that this wall is different from others without making it super obvious. Like here's a giant crack in it, like a bombable wall in a Zelda game might do or something like that, right? But yeah, I think at the end of the day, we want people to find secrets because we want them to feel smart. We want them to feel like they've accomplished something. And secrets in general in games are just super rewarding, I think. So everybody should have the ability to find many of them and feel observant and clever. But sometimes we want to make sure that there are some, extra hidden ones to really satisfy the people who, really dig secrets more than just normal, people do. But definitely, like I'm personally, and I might get shot for this, but I'm personally not a fan of the hidden barrels in Donkey Kong, the old Donkey Kong games that are just like off the edge of the screen that you just can't even see, and
like kill yourself to find them.
Exactly. It's just basically you have to keep jumping off the bottom of the screen in random places and hope that you manage to land in a barrel, which is just kind of bullshit, So I personally don't like those kind of secrets, and I choose to lean towards the ones where you can actually discover them if you are observant enough, pretty much. But some people really like those kinds of things that are just super hardcore and obscure, and you have to check a wiki to figure it out and stuff like that. It's just, it depends on what kind of games you're into or how much of a sucker for punishment you are, maybe. Yeah. So funnily enough, the E3 demo didn't actually go this far. It ended basically right at the entrance of this room. And we had a different scene there that had like a big tower in it and everything else. And that's what we basically focused on polishing for E3 to show off the new move and some of Ori's other new abilities and things like that. But then after E3, it was like, well, we do have to finish this environment, and it's basically half as long as the rest of our environments were normally going to be. So what do we do? How do we ramp it up and make it more interesting? And bringing in these kind of little explosive worms that you have to sort of escort and then bash into things. It was a prototype that we already had that was too difficult for like the E3 demo, obviously, because basically one of the tricky things with making this the E3 demo, the desert in general, is that it's a late game area. It was never intended to be the first thing that you play in the game. And so on the one hand, the E3 demo, we had to make sure that it was easy enough that everybody could kind of figure it out and get the gist of the controls and not die on every single spike. But then we wanted to make sure that we weren't designing, let's say the environment on baby mode. And then later on, it's like, well, how do we make this actually feel like a late game area? And so we did kind of like a mix where we made sure there was, challenge and everything else. And we added some spikes and some difficulty ramping in the later sequences as well to sort of offset that. But yeah, it was just an interesting thing where it's like we normally, for like an E3 demo, I think many games will just do this thing where the team will basically like take the very first level of the game and then just say, okay, cool, you're going to start from the literal start. But I don't really like that approach so much because that's like the most bland, basic early version of your game. And I was one of the people, I'm not the only one, to be fair, but I was one of the people that pushed for having something like this as the E3 demo, the burrow test, because it was a whole new ability that felt very different to Ori, And we also showed off the grapple in the same demo, which was very important because that one's also very, very cool and arguably even more versatile than the dig in some ways. But yeah, it was just like, how do we show off how much cooler this game is going to be compared to the first one? Apart from just saying it's going to be bigger and have more areas and more abilities and things, right? But then you play the demo and all you're doing is jumping and wall jumping, right? Like that's not exactly best foot forward for a mind-blowing demo or something. So yeah.
I think I saw in your folder of stuff, this specific sort of setup was quite early in your sort of prototypes.
Oh, yeah. This was one of the oldest ones. It was there in that very, very first demo that we sent to Microsoft. And it was one of the early things that I prototyped because it felt like, well, this is a crazy thing, like having to kind of dig through this environment while avoiding a giant laser and stuff that's rotating. And it's also one of those ones that went through quite a bit of iteration and back and forth from the team because it wasn't super easy, especially the first version that we did. But I pushed pretty hard to keep it around and make it like good enough for being in the final game because I kind of believed in it as this kind of ramp up for one of the final challenges of the burrow. And it felt very memorable, with the big spinning laser and it's the whole room filled with sand. And it's just about, gauging yourself and hiding these little holes and things. So yeah, I have a few videos if you want to look at those later and see how that kind of developed over time.
Absolutely. Something that's must have been an interesting challenge is by the time you get to the Windswept Wastes, you could have the, energy ball and, various combat powers, or you could not if you've got here too early, or not too early, but, earlier in the game. How do you, especially the light ball, because that gives you so much more platforming ability. Is it possible to like skip certain parts because you can just like bash over them.
The thing that you literally did with the sandworm there is a perfect example of just that, where yes, if you do have the light burst, which you do, you can actually just throw the light burst and you don't have to deal with the sandworms. And that is something that sort of came in a bit later, because the light burst for a long time was an optional ability that we were considering, like in the first game, but then eventually it got roped into a full area pretty much. And then it suddenly became this thing where it's like, oh, everyone's going to have it when they get here, and that breaks the situation. But to be totally fair, I think you're just in this mindset of like, I'm doing burrowing, I'm digging around and everything else. So you just naturally explore and find the solution to it. But we're also like firm believers in the ability of the player to take the tools that they're given throughout the game and solve the issue or solve the sequence of the problem the way that they feel is the most interesting or natural way to do it. As long as that doesn't feel like really boring or that it kind of undermines the entire situation. But honestly, throwing a grenade, catching it in the air with bash, and then dashing through a sandball in a sequence, it's not exactly the most trivial thing in the world either. So it's still a decent challenge that the player has to do to get through. It's just not exactly the way that it was designed in the level, but that's okay. That's the price you pay for a little bit of, freedom and options.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you consider this part of this sand worm boss rush sort of part of this of the Windswept Wastes?
Yeah, I do. It depends. If you mean, is it something that I worked on very heavily myself or whatever? Yes and no. But I do kind of consider it because I did have a pretty, heavy hand in some of the reworks that happened here over time. For example, the Windtorn Ruins originally was a dungeon. The idea was that we're going to have a cool dungeon at the end of this desert section where you're going to explore new mechanics, get a new ability, which was the drill, which actually would let you kind of burrow through really thick rock blockers, which ultimately got cut because it wasn't admittedly the most amazing versatile skill. It was very much like, once you've gotten rid of all the drill blockers, you never use the drill again. But it seemed like an interesting, addition on top of the burrow to be able to pass certain new blockers. But that's kind of like in the very like old school Metroidvania ability thing, where it's like, here's a red block, use your new ability to break red blocks. Here's the yellow block breaker. You know what I mean? And it's like, we didn't want to necessarily be that kind of game. We wanted every ability to feel like it really changed the way that you play, not just gave you a key to open a door or something like that, right? But yeah, so it was originally meant to be a dungeon, and it went through a number of iterations as a dungeon. But then when it came down to like production concerns and resource allocation, but also just like time and priority, we made the decision that it just wasn't necessary of content in the game pretty much. And we just said like, you know what, we wanted to keep the escape, because the escape was actually a really, interesting, unique master challenge of the burrow mechanic. And we needed the story beat of entering this temple, getting the golden, always getting Ser, the golden ball pretty much. And then going from here to the final dungeon. And we liked the fact that there was a sort of chase to sort of cap that all off. And then what we ended up doing very late in the project actually was replacing the dungeon part, which was never really fully worked out. So it's not like we had a full playable, super fun, amazing dungeon that we just said we're not going to do. It was very early prototype stage. So, we just cut our losses, and we decided that we would turn it into this linear storytelling moment. And it actually turned out to be perfect for pacing, because you've already done all these intense platforming challenges with the burrow leading up to this. You've already kind of shown your mastery of it. You've had enemies and lasers and projectiles and whatever. And you're about to go into one of the hardest challenges in the entire game, right? With the sandworm chase. And it's just really important for the pacing of the overall experience to sort of break it up every now and then. And this was also a great moment for us to sort of give the player more lore that they otherwise didn't have in the game. And also a bit of teasing for like the ending of the game and what's to become of Ori and everything else. So changing out what the contents of this dungeon actually was quite important for like the story as well as, production reasons and stuff. So it was kind of a win-win across the board. And I do think that pacing wise, it really leads into the escape, the really tense, challenging escape.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you have a pretty high intensity thing, especially that big laser room. And then you get a bit of a breather, and then then the rug's pulled out from under you. as something bad's about to happen.
Exactly. And and actually there's a video of it as well, but the original escape actually would snake through the dungeon. That was the original thing. And that was the very earliest iteration, but it actually wasn't all that fun because because of the constraint of having to reuse the environment that's part of the dungeon. It felt very drawn out and plotting and everything else. You have to hit the green blob that's on the pillar up there. It felt like it was very drawn out and not very tense and exciting because, an escape is something where you can't really make compromises on. In normal level design, in a Metroidvania, it's like this level has to work in multiple ways. We have to be able to backtrack and all this kind of stuff. In escape, you don't have to worry about those things, or you don't want to have to worry about, but this is also a room of a dungeon and it has to work this way, And so it's just sort of like, no, we wanted to make sure that our escapes were basically their own isolated moments where we had full control, where we could really, knock people's socks off with crazy explosions and giant worms and avalanches and whatever, we decided to throw your way pretty much. And so it went through a process of iteration, and I came on later on in the process to kind of basically rework the dungeon into this sort of story space and also like tighten up the escape, refine it. Basically, I think you've already talked to him before, but Milton Guasti, the AM2R designer who works at Moon, he actually did the initial version of the sandworm chase, and many or most of his ideas are actually still present in there. All of the really cool, memorable moments with the sandworm doing crazy stuff, those were all his ideas and layouts, basically. And then what happened was that I had to come in and kind of trim the fat because it was quite long, tighten up the platforming, rework a few things that were just way too difficult for people in the play tests and stuff. And so it went through a lot of rounds of iteration and streamlining and tightening to get to where it is. But I really like the fact that all of those key ideas that make it super memorable and unique, were already there from the very earliest iteration. And I'm glad that we could sort of keep that stuff in there while also making the platforming as tight as possible, pretty much, and making it not as difficult as it was originally, because there's some people that complain about this chase. It was much, much, much more difficult for a long period of time. And we did a lot of changes to make it more fun and more digestible and more playable for people. So we at the end of the day, we did want this to be a master challenge for not just the burrow, but for a number of abilities. And also just really, it's the final chase in the game, apart from if you consider the chase sections in the final boss fight chases. But it's the last proper escape, and we really wanted to make sure it felt like it, So at the end of the day, it is hard, but I don't know. I find it a lot of fun personally, but I'm a big fan of the burrow. So
I guess there's a challenge where you want players to kind of get through it just on the skin of their teeth. They don't want to be failing over and over and over again, because that kind of takes away some of the sort of drama of the situation. How do you just sort of balance this to make sure it's not a cakewalk, but also not so tedious?
Playtesting. It's really just that. I agree with you that you want the player to you don't want it to be it's funny because if somebody doesn't escape on their first try in the team, it's always it's never said as oh, I did it on my first try, I feel great. They're it's too easy, I did it on my first try. So everyone kind of acknowledges the fact that an escape needs to be something where you at least die once or twice, so that way it feels like it's a proper challenge and you're learning and you're getting better and improving. But nobody wants to die 5 times or 10 times in an escape, because then it starts to get really frustrating and tedious, and you start doing the same thing over and over again, and it feels like trial and error. So there has to be a lot in an escape that feels intuitive and natural, that you see it on screen and you know immediately how to overcome the challenge. And let's say maybe 60-80% of the escape has to kind of flow naturally while being challenging. But then there can be 20% where there's a couple curveballs thrown in there that catch you off guard or surprise you. And it still has to be reactable. It shouldn't be that you touch a random trigger and a thing falls on your head and you die, because that's just not fun. But stuff that makes you, that just surprises you. And you have to you die once and you go, oh crap, okay, next time I know this is going to happen when I get here, and I'll have to, react more quickly. But it all has to feel fair. It has to feel like I had the time to predict this thing. I had the time to read the situation. I just sort of failed to do so. And I can do better next time.
Cool. Well, that's me done with the level. Super fun. I can't believe I did that on my first. It wasn't really my first go because I've played that level like 3 times now. But I'm still proud of myself. That's not too bad.
That was pretty good. Are you on normal difficulty or easy?
Might be on easy.
Because don't worry, I won't tell anyone.
The problem is because I wanted to like rush through the game to get to this level because my only save game for Ori was at the final boss. The end of the game, so I had to start from scratch. So I put it on easy mode. I put on some cheats just to get to the Windswept Wastes. Cool, right? So I can come back to you. Hello, and do you want to show me some of your the other stuff?
Yeah, so there's quite a few things. Like if you want to see, like for example, I mentioned earlier, like some of the very first things I did at Moon were some concepts for these collapsing platforms. I'm not an artist. Well, I studied art, but clearly my forte is level design. But so basically I tried to lay out, well, what are some of these interesting situations like to introduce the very basic mechanics of collapsing platforms, right? And so it's all pretty straightforward stuff like dangerous laser or something. You have to mix bash in between. Or for example, I liked this one where it's sort of multi-use, right? So first you have to jump on the platform, don't touch the ground, then jump over again. And then when it comes back on the other side, you use it to then get up to somewhere higher pretty much, right? So that felt like a cool way to make use of this unique element. Or something like this where you have to force yourself to drop down, catch yourself after dropping, and then use a double jump to get out, and just playing with all kinds of different, like just on paper, really, like what would be interesting ways to use this gameplay element interestingly. And so, for example, this was one of the sort of master challenges that never made it into the game, but I did build it and I quite liked it, but it just didn't fit in the grand scheme of the environment. So for example, like you'd have to do this long tower climb and mix bashing with collapsing platforms to get to the very top. And obviously if you made a mistake, you would just fall all the way down. And there was actually, there was actually a concept made for that because the concept artists at one point did some paint overs of some of the sketches.
Oh, wow.
It never made it into the game and it was a early concept, but you can see that the early collapsing platforms were actually this kind of magical golden floating thing that would kind of rematerialize and everything. So like early on, there was like exploration for what could they be? Are they these kind of sort of rocky platforms that collapse? Are they these sort of glowing golden things? You can see that this one was also similar to the collapsing tower idea that I'd sketched out, So it's fun that sometimes the artists kind of take like inspiration from the level design and other times we take inspiration from the artists to build our levels more like the concept would be, And then, like I said, I had these concepts for things like the burrow, or for example, here was like the very simplest like illustration of the drill ability that got cut. But it's sort of like you could have these kind of big rocks that are blocking your path or have collectibles in them, and you can only get through them once you've unlocked that ability. But that didn't really make it into the game. We even had some ideas of things like, what about this big physical block that you can't get past? And you actually have to burrow left and right underneath it to kind of tunnel out the ground so it can fall down and everything else and open a path. Obviously, you can imagine the programmers weren't too thrilled about that kind of idea, so it didn't make it in. Because honestly, the dig trail ultimately is basically it's a graphic. It's not really physically chewing away the ground. But it was still fun to think about what are some cool, crazy ways that we could use this ability. And I think there was actually a concept art sketch for that idea too. There's a big block and you could have to drop it down to get through and stuff like that. And there was also like this cool exploration of like, what could the sand look like? How do you differentiate it from other ground pieces and stuff like that? It wasn't necessarily easy to actually capture that in a 2D game, right? Because you don't have these big 3D spheres sort of chewed out of the sand. It's really all just a bunch of sprites and textures that are giving the impression of it. And the trail as well, to make it feel like it's this chewed out thing. But I think that the artists and programmers that worked on this really did a nice job of capturing that feel, despite the fact that it's all 2D graphics, basically.
When you're coming up with these things, are you thinking ahead of like, this is going to piss off the programmers, or do you just try and not think too hard about that and just let your imagination run wild?
I wish I could think less about that, but no, it's very much the kind of thing that we have to consider all the time. But especially early on with concepting and stuff, we tend to let our imaginations run a bit wild. And because sometimes our programmers can be just as crazy as we are, or more so. And they'll see an idea that they love and they'll say, we have to do that. We have to figure out how to make this possible. It's just too cool of an idea, right? So it's not always them sort of saying, we can't do this, we're gatekeeping and all that kind of stuff. But there's definitely, technical constraints are not something to just sort of underestimate, or, you really have to navigate those at a certain point. But yeah, like you can see here as well, like a concept paint over of one of the first versions of the rotating laser room as well. We also did like research on the different kinds of sandworms you could have. In the end, we only had like the base one and the small worm, and of course the giant one for the escape. But we had an idea for like sort of a big mama worm that would kind of leave an acid trail or something. We even did concepts for, because this was another one of those things where we're thinking, what would be a cool escalation of this kind of enemy? And it would be, well, it leaves like a trail for a short duration and it kind of dissipates, a bit like Snake. And you have to kind of not only dig through and try to attack the enemy, but you have to try to avoid this dynamic obstacle that's kind of being formed through the movement of the enemy. But it's one of those things that it was like, it just didn't make it because we had so many things to do to make the game as it is. And the environment held up without extra layers of complexity. It's like in some of these environments, it feels like we had enough ideas to almost do its own little sub game, around a certain mechanic or concept or whatever. But then it's just the process is finding what works best, what's the easiest for players to appreciate and understand and enjoy, and what's like a novel idea, but not necessarily gonna make the game so much better. And I remember one day I found this video. One day I thought, well, what if I have a platform, like a sand platform that's so thin that you can't actually dig? And so what would happen is you would burrow into it and immediately be bounced out and then have the trajectory of launching out like you normally do when you hit the surface. And it ended up becoming a kind of trampoline platform that you would have to sort of dash into to then launch yourself. That felt kind of fun, but it came a bit late in the process when I was messing around with that and didn't really make it into the game. But it's just to show like that's the process of, hey, I have a funny idea of how I can use this element. Let me just try it and see what comes out of it. And then, maybe it doesn't make it into the game, but if it was fun enough and if it was versatile enough, like we'd find a way,
So you building these in Unity?
Yeah. Unity with our own proprietary tools that were made by the team over the course of like working on Ori and the Blind Forest, and then carried over into the sequel. But yeah, it's very, very simple, like very, very simple shapes and stuff that we would work with, just like blocking these things out. With the sand would be a separate, version of the collider, but it would actually have an extra property that allows you to burrow into it and stuff. Oh, I remember I mentioned earlier that there was, we used to have the burrow on Y, to be able to control. And this video I was actually looking at the other day where I was explaining that it's an issue because the way it worked was this, where if you would use the ability and there's no sand, it would dash you, right? Like in a direction, because it would feel weird that if you press the input and nothing happens. That's always kind of like a big no-no when it comes to game design and feel. And so it was kind of strange. And it's like, well, we have to have something, but then it would just give you this extra big boost in the air that's almost more useful than being able to burrow because you can just launch yourself over small obstacles and things. And so this was kind of when we started talking about like having it contextualized and maybe streamlining it onto the dash button and things like that pretty much. But it wasn't, super straightforward. But yeah, it's fun looking back at these. Like you can listen to them too, because there's some explanations of what we were thinking at the time and problems we were having and stuff, but just kind of illustrates a little bit of the process that we'd go through, and that it's not like we have it all figured out from the start and we're just going to basically build it the way that we envisioned, but really some of these things just come naturally as we go. Because we're very much like a very iterative studio where everything we do just goes through iteration after iteration. We test, we try, we see what's fun, and then we just keep refining until we have something that feels like it belongs in the final game pretty much.
So I can make sure I got this right. So you started with, I want to make an interesting ability for Ori, which is the burrow, and that lends itself to sand. So it should probably be in a desert. And then at some point you realized that the breakable platforms could also be sand and then linked them together. Is that about right?
Yeah, pretty much. it was that process of like exploring different ideas and then realizing that for the story and the environment art and everything, we wanted a desert. And then, okay, cool, we've got this burrow, it lends itself to sand. And then we started to come up with other elements that would complement it. Like, for example, in this one, I had just basically there's these little green plants that you can jump on that then drop XP orbs and things. And I just took one of those and removed the collider and just kept the trigger zone. And I put like a yellow texture on it or something and some shiny effects and put them in the sand. And I was like, what would this be interesting to sort of encourage the player to dig around the space and not just basically go from point A to point B, but actually get closer to those spikes because they get something for it, or like find a hidden path on the side because there's something that's kind of telegraphing or guiding them towards that. Those kinds of things always feel quite nice, but the team wanted to be very careful that we didn't end up like in Mario or Rayman, where you've got just like constant trails of golden shinies that basically telegraph all of the jumps in the level, and you just feel like you're going through the motions to collect them. So we ended up using them quite sparingly, but it definitely added this kind of nice little flavor to digging and stuff. You get the satisfaction. You don't have to do anything except properly aim your movement. But then when you go through a nice trajectory of these little things and they all pop and give you shinies, it felt really, really rewarding. So again, that's just one of those things where we just kind of played around with elements we had, mixed them with the stuff that we were trying to do, and tried to see like what could come out of it that felt like it was worth keeping in the game. I also have like a video of the E3 demo. I took it from a YouTube video just because I don't have any like footage from myself, but to compare like the where it ended. Like for example, if you see the end of the E3 demo, it's at this door here, which is in the final game. It's after a room where you're collecting 2 keystones.
Yeah.
You remember this one? Yeah.
Yeah.
And so basically the demo ended here after you would get those keystones. And then on the other side of this, it would take you straight to a room that has the big desert tower in the background. Right. And that was a nice way to sort of wrap up the demo and go like, ooh, what's this cool, mysterious place? And how do I get there? And all that kind of stuff. And you'll have to wait till the final game to find out. But then the funny thing is like, yeah, that was the end of the level. Like we didn't have anything else after that. And we had to rebuild it. And then the other interesting thing was people loved that tower moment in the team, myself included, but it didn't work there. Because where do you go from a scene like that? You can't have this big open scene with a big vista and stuff, and then just like platform around it. You don't want to cover up the vista. And so what we ended up doing was putting it in a different part of the environment. There's a save room with, Talk, the bird guy.
Yeah.
So that way you can discover it on the main path, but it's like just a little branch off, but it's not in the main path. But it at least gives you this ability to find it, get that flavor there. And the other interesting thing that we like to do in this game is because it's not really 3D space, but we still want to give the impression that you're getting closer and closer to things from starting like further away. The way we can do that is that we show you a landmark in one scene and it's really small. And then later on, we show you another version of the landmark, but it's slightly bigger. And then you get to the final scene and you're at the landmark and you're inside of it. And so this was a good moment where like halfway through the level, and if you look in the actual map of the Windswept Wastes, you can see that it's almost directly positioned straight below the tower entrance scene, because it's meant to be this kind of perspective of like, okay, it's off in the distance, you're going to go there eventually, and then you discover it and you're actually there and it's huge and you enter and all that kind of stuff. Obviously, logically, it doesn't make sense because you're not going into the distance, you're going vertically and horizontally and stuff. But it gives this nice sort of like breadcrumb trail as you're exploring the environment, where you're showing the player, something that they're getting closer and closer to as they explore. And then eventually they're right up in it. And it feels like a cool little, like, I finally arrived moment, So we wanted to keep it there at some point.
Can you see the game there?
Yep.
Yeah. So I think this is the area you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. It's that. Yeah. Some people weren't so happy with the way it turned out because they felt like it was really pristine before, and having the well there kind of like took away from the majesty. But at the end of the day, like it was probably one of the only ways that we could really keep this in the flow and have it make sense. And we definitely had to, because it's an amazing shot. It's a really gorgeous art and everything else. And I think at least when you're on the ledge looking out with Talk, you do preserve that vista that you had in the original demo. So we just tried to work that in.
Absolutely. Cool. Is there anything else that I missed or I haven't asked or people should know about this level?
Um, I mean, I think we talked about most of it. Yeah, I mean, I don't really have much else to share, I guess. I think we went through pretty thoroughly. And like I said, I shared all the materials, so you'll be able to look at them. And if there's anything else that catches your eye, you want to mention or something, that's fine too. But no, it was one of those environments that really was one of the earliest ones we worked on, along with the very first environment of the game, Inkwater Marsh, mostly because of the early prototyping stuff that I mentioned. And it was just a very interesting one because it was the E3 demo. It was the first time that we polished some part of the environment and the gameplay to be ship quality, basically. And it was cool that it turned out to be this level that I was one of the people that was working very closely on for so long, and being able to show that at E3 and everything else and get people's hands on it was actually a pretty special moment. And yeah, then it was an interesting challenge to take it, and we knew what worked from it, and then turn it into something that actually fit for the final game, because it was designed for one purpose and then it had to be redesigned or shuffled around to fit a different one. It's an interesting challenge, but I like the fact that I can look back on all these different materials and the start to finish process and really see all the work that we put into it as a team, and then got it to where it finally ended up. So yeah.
Definitely. Cool. Well, thank you so much for your time, Chris. This was so interesting, and it's a great level. I really enjoyed playing it when I first played Ori, and it's just been fun to play it again.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. It's nice to talk to you about this stuff. Like, for me, it's not to get too sappy, but it's really nostalgic and fun to look back. I mean, it's been over a year since the game came out, and dust settled and all that kind of stuff. And it's nice to look back at all these materials and remember like all of these cool moments and the process and how we got there and everything. So it's fun to be able to talk about that with you and share a bit of that insight, because otherwise these videos and concepts and things just kind of sit on a hard drive and they don't have any use, but it's nice to be able to share them with someone who can at least have a look and maybe appreciate the work that went into them. So
yeah, definitely.